lives we meet pleasant and positive, or plus persons, such as Pete Wayne and his mother, the contemplation of whom would be safe for the most immature 16-year-old. But it would be very, very unsafe to set before some young women the splendidly delineated Mrs. Vincent Farron of that same book. Just because her husband knew perfectly how to deal with her, how to break her, it does not follow that thousands of decent, affectionate, kind, and rather muddle-headed, young men can fill successfully the role of tigress tamers. Yes, the great defect of Mrs. Miller's stories is that we seldom care to know the people in them, the Mrs. Farrons, the Nancy Almars, nor even the Christine Fnemers and the innocent but tiresomely insipid Mathilde Severances. We will occasionally consent to meet them and watch them perform, better company being lacking at the moment, for one main reason and only one, the skill with which they are brought before us and they're put through their tricks. And if our very figure of speech seems to have in it something derogatory, to imply that these persons are not much better than puppets, the implication is not without an honest significance. Moving among artificialities, surrounded by polite and transparent deceptions, it would be too much not to expect these society folk to partake of their environment. They are wholly mechanistic, to go to metaphysics for a suitable term, they are precious puppets and nothing more. Thanks to Mrs. Miller's skill, the strings which control them are mostly invisible, but the jerky motion of them gives the secret away. Having been as honest about this as we know how to be, let us turn to the first pages of Ladies Must Live and cull a few samples of Mrs. Miller's writing, samples which will convey to those who have not read her some idea of her gift of epigram and facile and beautiful characterization. Mrs. Usher turned toward hidden social availability very much as the dowser's hazel wand turns toward the hidden spring. She was unaware of her own powers, and really supposed that her sudden and usually ephemeral friendships were based on mutual attraction. During the short period of their existence, Mrs. Usher gave to these friendships the utmost loyalty and devotion. She agonized over the financial, domestic and romantic troubles of her friends. She sat up till the small hours, talking to them like a schoolgirl. During the height of their careers she organized plots for their assistance, and even when their stars were plainly on the decline, she would often ask them to lunch, if she happened to be alone. Many people, we know, are prone to make friends with the rich and great. Mrs. Usher's genius consisted in having made friends with them before they were either. Nancy Almar's husband says to her, "I hope you'll explain to them why I could not come." "You mean that I would not have gone if you had?" "No," he said, "that I'm called south on business." "I shan't tell them that, but I'll tell them you say so, if you like." She was as good as her word, she usually was. Would anyone like to hear Roland's explanation of why he is not with us? "Had it anything to do with his not being asked?" said a pale young man, and as soon as he had spoken he glanced hastily round the circle to ascertain how his remark had succeeded. So far as Mrs. Almar was concerned it had not succeeded at all. In fact, though he did not know it, nothing he said would ever succeed with her again. although a week before she had hung upon his every word. He had been a new discovery, something unknown and bohemian, but alas, a day or two before, she had observed that underlying his socialistic theories was an aching desire for social recognition. He liked to tell his bejeweled hostesses about his friends the car drivers, but, 20 times more, he would have liked to tell the car drivers about his friends the bejeweled hostesses. For this reason Mrs. Almar despised him, and where she despised she made no secret of the fact. "Not asked, Mr. Wickham," she said. "I assume my husband is asked wherever I am," and then turning to Laura Usher she added with a faint smile, "One's husband is always asked, isn't he?" "Certainly, as long as you never allow him to come," said another speaker. "Even from so slight an excerpt we think it will be plain that in the art of characterization and in the business of writing dialogue Mrs. Miller has nothing to learn. She is really one of the most hopeful prospects in American literature today, and the great hope for her and for readers lies in the possibility, almost a probability, that she will abandon the very restricted and unimportant milieu of her recent novels for better fields. It is simple honesty to recognize that the happiest time of their lives holds out a great promise that she will do this. Such persons as Pete Wayne and his mother, and even the rather pathetic grandfather Mr. Lanley, of the New York Lanleys, are real, that is, members of the human community and not sickening products of the social hothouses. If Mrs. Miller will do a novel in which most of the men and most of the women are people, regular people or irregular people, great or small, does not matter, but they must be people, we in America will be the first to acclaim her. Of Mrs. Miller herself there are only a few brief facts to be stated. This tall and charming woman was born in New York in 1874, the daughter of James G. K. Dewar and Elizabeth Meads Dewar. She was graduated from Barnard College, Columbia University, in 1899. She was married to Henry Wise Miller of New York on the 5th of October, 1899. Her New York home on the Upper East Side of the city, just below Central Park and just off Fifth Avenue, is in the most fashionable residence section, is in the heart of that region where most of her characters unquestionably live and where most of the others aspire to. Books by Alice Dewar Miller. The Modern Obstacle, 1903. Calderon's Prisoner, 1904. Less Than Kin, 1909. Blue Arch, 1910. Are Women People? 1915. Come Out of the Kitchen, 1916. Ladies Must Live, 1917. The Happiest Time of Their Lives, 1918. Wings in the Night, 1918. Poems. The Charm School, 1919. Harper and Brothers. The Beauty and the Bolshevist, 1920. Harper and Brothers. Manslaughter, 1921. Dodd, Mead and Company. With certain exceptions noted, books are published by the Century Company, New York. Chapter 6. Eleanor Hallow L. Abbott. Eleanor Hallow L. Abbott, Eleanor Hallow L. Abbott Coburn, Mrs. Fordyce Coburn, is the most fanciful writer in America today. Fanciful, inventive, not imaginative in the large and proper sense of the word imagination. Her method in writing is utterly different from that of any other popular author. She is in this respect as unique as Harold Bell Wright, to whom she bears no resemblance whatever. Wright starts a novel, we hope the reader will pardon this digression, by making an elaborate outline, synopsis, scenario, not of the story but of certain moral and ethical ideas, concepts and principles which he wishes to impress upon his readers. Sometimes up to the very last typewritten draft of one of his books the characters are known only by words denoting the things they stand for. Then, at the 11th hour, Wright strikes out greed and inserts Obadiah Jackson and manliness and inserts David Fanning, and the copy goes to the printer. Mrs. Coburn, or Miss Abbott as we may permit ourselves to call her because of her pen name's connotations, Miss Abbott finds a title and then constructs her story. Her stories are made to revolve around the title, rather than an outgrowth of any plot, says a writer in the Boston Globe, upon whose article we rely mainly for the facts of this chapter. It is an article with rather too much fluff, but it presents the really interesting facts about the author of Molly Make-Believe and presents them with point. The writer of it says, once a satisfactory title occurs to Miss Abbott, she follows it in exactly the same manner as the detective who is pursuing a clue. This is perfectly intelligible. Molly Make-Believe as a title teems with ideas, so does the sick abed lady, so does the white linen nurse. My characters are always wholly imaginary. I have never yet put a real person in a story. I doubt if I ever shall, for once I begin to weave a tale, imagination has too vivid a hold on me. Upon this the Boston Globe writer remarks, with a great deal of truthfulness, she may choose a commonplace subject, a girl, a woman, a road, a husband. Mrs. Coburn immediately succeeds in placing hers in the uncommon category. It is the qualifying adjective that plays a prominent part in making her subjects peculiarly original. She specifies that her heroine is a sick abed lady, her girl is very tired, her thoroughfare is a runaway road, and even the husband in her sanitarium story is a Sunday spouse. It is not her nomenclature alone that is unique and attractive. Added to marked creative ability, she has a quality of verbal fitness, and her phrases are charged with amazing intensity and force, so that there is an exhilaration in her pages. Indeed, as one of her friends said, after reading The Kink in the Air, one about decides that it is the kink in this author's style that is its chiefest charm. Many scoff. Franklin P. Adams used to divert himself with Eleanor Hallowell Abbottisms, scratching the surface of the ground like an industrious hen you may uncover many choice morsels of wriggling English. But if you think these are all the Eleanor Hallowell Abbott books contain, you are as deluded as the hen that thinks she has uncovered Earth's deepest secrets. Below, far below, but not buried at such a depth as to be uncoverable by ordinary minds, are veins of pure humor, tenderness, the rich gold of sympathy and friendly fancifulness. They are paying streaks. Pick up a reprinted copy of Molly Make-Believe and look at the page in the front which records over 20 editions in 5 years. We follow the lead of the Boston Globe article. Miss Abbott works slowly and carefully. Her chief concern while writing is with her own feeling about the tale she is at work upon. Unless she comes to like it pretty well, she does not send it to a publisher. It must interest her first as some sort of warranty that it will interest others. Painter, musician, writer, whether anybody else likes your work or not, she says, doesn't specially matter if you can only bring that work to the point where you like it yourself. She writes entirely upon the typewriter. Even the first draft is composed on a machine. Frequently she spends the entire day at her machine. In writing The Sick-A-Bed Lady she devoted 12 hours each day for 9 days to the task, and this, with one exception, is the quickest story-making she has ever accomplished. It is, by any standard, a tremendous bit of work. 3, 4, rarely 6 hours a day is the ordinary day's work of a busy writer. 12 hours on a stretch can be and is managed once in a great while when circumstances make the work imperative, but it is not managed for more than a day or two and is usually followed by a complete rest, sometimes in bed and with medical attendance. 12 hours a day for 9 days, it will make the hardiest shudder. Many of the best American writers are entirely satisfied if they do 500 or 1,000 words a day, and not every day at that. But as a rule Miss Abbott takes from a month to a year to write in such time as she can dedicate to it a short story, or a long short story, or a short novel. In 8 years she wrote some 20 stories. For 2 years in succession she won a $1,000 prize in Collier's weekly short story contests with The Very Tired Girl and The Sick-A-Bed Lady. Before her marriage to Dr. Fordyce Coburn, Miss Abbott was secretary and English assistant in the State Normal School at Lowell, Massachusetts. This job kept her at her desk all day, and it was in hours when she might have been expected to be asleep or resting or playing that she hunted titles and let her fancy do what it would with them. She used a pen name at first. Her first serious attempts at writing were in verse. 2 long poems published in Harper's Magazine attracted much attention. How curiously things go in this world. Miss Abbott had furnished the text and scheme for an advertising circular sent out by a Boston firm. The circular was so strikingly good that business houses began to come to its originator with offers of advertising contracts. Miss Abbott was for some time in a state of indecision as to whether she should develop her gift for writing advertisements or try to succeed with stories. Finally she sent 2 tales to 2 magazines with the mental resolution, if these are rejected, I believe I'll take up commercial writing. But both stories were accepted. Miss Abbott says that she owes her success as a fictioneer, therefore, to Lippincott's magazine and the Smart Set quite as much as to anything else. As readers will have suspected, Miss Abbott is a member of the family which has attained distinction in letters and theology both. She is a daughter of the Reverend Edward Abbott, sometime editor of the Literary World of Boston, a niece of Dr. Lyman Abbott, editor of the Outlook and Henry Ward Beecher's successor at Plymouth Church, Brooklyn, and a granddaughter of the Jacob Abbott who wrote the Rollo books for boys. Miss Abbott's father was born in Farmington, Maine, and was graduated from New York University in 1860, 7 years after his brother, Lyman Abbott, matriculated at the same institution. Edward Abbott studied theology at the Andover Theological Seminary and served as pastor of the Pilgrim Congregational Church at Cambridge, Massachusetts. From 1869 to 1878 he was editor of the Congregationalist, afterward he became editor of the Literary World. He was ordained a minister of the Episcopal Church in 1879 and served as rector of St. James's Church, Cambridge, until 1896. Like his father, Jacob Abbott, Edward Abbott wrote some juvenile books as well as several histories and biographies. Eleanor Hallowell Abbott was born in Cambridge in 1872. Largely educated by private tutors, she was for a short time a student in the public schools and afterward a special student at Radcliffe. She was a child exceedingly fond of outdoor life. Although she remembers kind and patient teachers, she can recall no day when the walls of a schoolroom did not fret and torment her with the sense of physical confinement. The one or two things I understood at all I learned so quickly that it drove me almost crazy waiting for the 50 or more classmates to catch up, and the great many things I didn't understand I was too frightened to learn in such a crowd. I can't look upon little, playful, daydreaming, high-strung children shut up in an iron-bound schoolroom without experiencing a very large lump in my throat. At the Harvard Grammar School in Cambridge, her teachers first discovered the Abbott talent in her surprising fondness for English composition, a subject not customarily dear to the hearts of school children, and in her rapturous delight in reading aloud Washington Irving's sketchbook. Certainly, says Miss Abbott, I never showed any other special signs of intelligence, being always, I remember, at the extreme foot of my class in every subject except English. Surely nothing but my father's unfailing sympathy and understanding sustained either me or my teachers, through the dreadful period of fractions and other mathematical horrors. And it was here at this school that I formed the first intellectual friendship of my life with a little, fair-haired, blue-eyed, earnest-minded boy who is now Professor Thomas Whittemore, of Tufts College. While the other children giggled over ink-dipped pigtails, wrote facetious notes about their teachers, and traded postage stamps, we too were whispering about authors and exchanging autographs and timidly confiding literary ambitions to each other. Funny little people we must have been, astonishingly solemn, inordinately dignified and most deliciously important, with all the grave, childish self-consciousness of having already fixed our minds on higher things. I recall one day when we were swapping a Longfellow check stub for a Whittier postcard, or something of that sort. We got caught at it and were kept ignominiously after school, to the infinite delight of our more frivolous-minded companions. Miss Abbott's husband, Dr. Fordyce Coburn, is the silent partner in her work to whom Molly Make-Believe is dedicated. He aids and abets her in her stories, in taking a course in playwriting at Harvard under Professor George Baker, in anything she wants to do. Dr. Coburn is medical advisor of the Lowell High School and an all-round athlete and sportsman whenever a city practice will release him sufficiently. He and Mrs. Coburn spend their spare time salmon fishing in Maine, playing tennis at Lowell, coon and wild turkey hunting on the edge of the Florida Everglades, doing anything, in fact, that two persons, husband and wife, great comrades and possessing similar tastes, can always find to do happily together. Books by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. Molly Make-Believe, 1910. The Sick Abed Lady, 1911. The White Linen Nurse, 1913. The Indiscreet Letter, 1915. Little Eve Edgarton, 1915. The Stingy Receiver, 1917. Published by the Century Company, New York. The Ennui Du Much, 1918. Published by Dodd, Mead and Company, New York. Old Dad, 1919. Published by E. P. Dutton and Company, New York. Chapter XXX Harriet T. Comstock. The significant thing about Harriet T. Comstock has been her role in reprint. After a novel has met the demand for it in the regular edition, the plates from which it is printed are turned over to Grosset and Dunlap or some other publishing house which issues popular books in inexpensive form. The show has left Broadway to go on the road. And, you might not think it, but sometimes the worth of a show is never known until it hits the road. The worth of Mrs. Comstock was never known until Joyce of the Northwoods went into reprint. The book, at over $1, had a good, average sale. Is 10,000 copies a good average sale? Reader, it is. Think not that all novels are bestsellers. That's no more the case than that all the sellers are the best novels. Joyce went into reprint and in 3 months sold 60,000 copies, and then it sold and sold and sold, and so, when they came to be reprinted, did Janet of the Dunes and A Son of the Hills. In a little more than 3 years these 3 novels in reprint went to 250,000 copies. Since then the Place Beyond the Winds and later books have been put out by the reprinters. Is there any question of Mrs. Comstock's importance? We think not. But what's the explanation? What, in the vernacular, is the answer? The answer is just this: Mrs. Comstock is an earnest, sincere, enthusiastic writer. She is an educated woman, a suffragist, with experience in public speaking and a familiarity with public affairs. She is a homemaker who has always made the keeping of a pleasant home in Flatbush, Brooklyn, her chief business, and who wrote at first just for fun, and as she had the chance, she has convictions and no more hesitates to act upon them than to express them. She is personally modest. You have to dig things out of her about herself. But, is this the answer? Is there something else? Yes, there is this else. Mrs. Comstock has worked with intensive culture and a visible reward the peculiarly modern literary field known, it really isn't so known but it will be, as idealism. What's that? There are realists and romanticists, although no two of us agree as to what makes a literary realist, what a romanticist. Yet we all recognize the distinction. It is a sure if shadowy boundary. But a literary idealist. The literary idealist is the product of everybody's dissatisfaction with what the other two give us. Vexed with the clash of the allopath and the homeopath, some send for the osteopath. The figure of speech we employ is no offhand metaphor. Literary idealists like Mrs. Constock are a kind of literary osteopaths. They go at us vigorously. They decline to dose us with the nauseous compounds of realism, and they shudder at the thought of our taking sugar pellets of romance. What they want us to do is to let them rub, thump, pound and flex us, mentally and emotionally, of course. They say, now, see here. Your intellect and your emotions may not be very wonderful, but they are your own. Exercise them. Rely on them. Keep well and happy by using them to the fullest extent. They are what the Lord gave you. Don't try to refine them till they become flabby. Don't use them brutally till they go to pieces. Recognize your limitations and you'll be all right. That's Mrs. Constock's secret, whether she would put it that way herself or not. She is not a great novelist in the usual acceptation of the word. She is, in respect of literary distinction, not even a good novelist. Aesthetically considered, she is nowhere. Practically considered, she is in 100,000 homes, entertaining people, instructing people, osteopathizing, making them use the brains and feelings they have, preventing them from aping something they have not and cannot acquire, killing snobbery at the roots, arresting the blight of disillusionment, and convincing young and old that certain simple, fundamental instincts and certain simple, fundamental principles of character are what count, with them. She is right, they do. Conviction about the truth of life, conviction as to the best use of the novel, namely, to present the great truths of life in an attractive manner, where they will reach the greatest number of people. This sums up Harriet T. Constock. How did she come to write The Place Beyond the Winds, which presents the question of eugenics and the ethics of silence on certain matters affecting marriage? Mrs. Constock's face saddens and she tells you, I had a most unpleasant experience once. I happened to learn that the very attractive son of a dear friend of mine was totally unfit to marry the girl to whom he was engaged. I approached the young man, but found him obdurate, so, after a long mental and spiritual struggle, I revealed the facts to the girl's mother. It was the most trying experience of my life. Then the feeling came to me that I must write about it, must do my small part toward banishing the evil. Exactly. There you have the idealist in action as well as in literature. It is perfectly plain what some people will think of Mrs. Constock's course. It is equally plain that hundreds of thousands will approve it. Do her the fine justice to acknowledge that whatever anyone thought of it, that even if everyone else in the world condemned her, she would have done as she did. She has, in a showdown, absolute and unlimited courage. Then and then only is her rooted modesty and her equally rooted humor put aside. As for the humor that is hers, it comes out fully in the narrative of her experiences campaigning for suffrage. As she once wrote, and then the auntie who became converted and in a burst of gratitude sent me a bottle of Benedictine. Maybe she felt as the young girl at a revival once felt who electrified the congregation by shouting, "Good Lord! My jewelry is dragging me down to hell, I am going to give it to my sister." Go out to Flatbush, as Alice Lawton did one sunshiny afternoon, afterward relating her experience in the book News Monthly. Travel along a broad, tree-shaded street between rows of real homes with full complement of flower gardens and babies and puppies. Stop at a pretty, wide veranda'd, white-pillared house and call upon Mrs. Constock, wife, mother, homemaker, novelist, a Jill of many trades and successful at them all. She seats you in a cozy, brown-walled drawing room, beside a little round table. You eat piping hot buttered toast and crisp jumbles, and drink properly brewed tea. Sonny comes strolling in, a large, beautifully marked Burne-Jonesy yellow Catter Persian. The creature is polite but heads for a little mahogany desk and sniffs at the single drawer. It contains his catnip. The hostess is the sort of woman you make confidences to. Mrs. Constock is cheerful, has smiling eyes, a loving toned voice, curly grey hair, wears pretty clothes and almost always flowers. One feels a hearty welcome even when one telephones her. She never sounds annoyed, nor even interrupted. Upstairs there's a bright little room where she works. Couch in one corner, built-in bookcase in another, big desk in the middle. The desk is heaped with piles of closely written paper and books. On the soft buff paper of the walls are paintings, drawings, photographs. The originals of illustrations to Mrs. Constock's books are noticeable. Here she writes most of each novel, subjected to endless interruptions. Friends and neighbors of a novelist never take the novelist's work seriously. When the finishing chapters are to be done, Mrs. Constock packs manuscript, pencils and paper and goes away. Her publishers and her husband have the address, no one else. She is one of the extremely few novelists who do not use a typewriter. She writes it all out longhand and makes several copies before she gets through. She began by writing stories for the school paper. She continued by writing children's stories, then books for older girls and boys. Janet of the Dunes was her first novel. Thomas Hardy is her favorite author. Whenever I feel that I am stranded, I read Hardy and regain my poise. He discusses so clearly and nobly the problems with which we are struggling today. And I also like Barry, principally, I think, because he knows women so thoroughly, and I always know he knows. Stevenson once said of George Eliot that when she wrote of men they always put their hands up to feel if their hair is coming down, but Barry writes of women without their appearing with a cigar in their hands. Of her method of work Mrs. Constock says, "The first thing I see is the place and the people, the background and the actors. Then their story begins to unfold in my mind. When the time comes that story must be written before I can have any peace of mind, I sit down to it, not before. Other writers, I understand, usually see the story or the people first, and the background later. With me, the background, the environment of my characters, is all important. Why, I even keep a set of pictures of the country I am writing of on my desk beside me. Mrs. Constock always goes to the scene of her stories. Her backgrounds are always of actual places and her people are frequently real people. Thus in Joyce of the Northwoods her St. Angie is a place in northern New York and all the lesser characters are taken from life. In The Vindication, Dr. Hill is straight out of actuality. On a suffrage tour Mrs. Constock met this young physician whose work had been so largely among the Adirondack poor. He, too, had adopted a backward and neglected child, just as Dr. Hill takes hold of the boy Chester in Mrs. Constock's novel. A son of the Hills was the fruit of a visit in the Virginia mountains. Not the immediate fruit. Some time had to elapse before Mrs. Constock could see the story in the Mountaineers. In Mamselle Joe, Mrs. Constock has gone up north again, to the St. Lawrence country, and she tells the moving story of a woman of 40 who has at last struggled clear of debt and is at last able to gratify the instinct of mother love which is in her. Popular she is, but she does not think of popularity. In truth a writer cannot. For, as Mrs. Constock says, the writer who thinks of the possible popularity of her work when she should be thinking of her story will impair her work. And her work is the thing with Mrs. Constock. Reject it if you like. Accept it if you will, she will go unshakably on. She has something to do and is about doing it. Books by Harriet T. Constock. Janet of the Dunes, 1908. Joyce of the Northwoods, 1911. A Son of the Hills, 1913. The Place Beyond the Winds, 1914. The Vindication, 1917. Mamselle Joe, a novel of the St. Lawrence country, 1918. Unbroken Lines, 1919. The Shield of Silence, 1921. At the Crossroads, 1922. Also many books for boys and girls. Mrs. Constock's earlier books are to be had in reprint. Janet of the Dunes was published by Little, Brown and Company, Boston. The others are published by Doubleday, Page and Company, New York. Chapter XXXI on Orwell's Nothing is so satisfactory to write about as a novelist with ideas, but in writing about Mrs. Orwell's we shall not discuss her ideas. It will be enough to try faithfully to set them before her thousands of readers and the thousands who ought to be her readers, to try to picture Mrs. Wills herself. That is all that can be done in a chapter of reasonable length. To discuss intelligently Mrs. Wills's ideas would require a book and an amount of exact knowledge on certain subjects, immigration and Americanization, for example, that is no part of our reporter's equipment. A straightaway bit of exposition must do instead. The spring of 1919 will see the publication of a new novel by Mrs. Wills, The Forbidden Trail, an exciting story of the Still Jim Country, Arizona and the irrigable West. The novel deals with the clever efforts of German spies and sympathizers to appropriate for Germany the discoveries and improvements made by the sturdy Americans of our United States Reclamation Service. This theme is not so completely derived from the war as might appear at first glance. Readers of Still Jim will recall in the closing chapters the visit of Herr Gluck to the Cabillo Dam and his effort to get Jim Manning to enter the service of the German government, in a legitimate way, however. Of the illegitimate ways in which Germany was then working among American engineers, Mrs. Wills is now free to speak and may be trusted to speak out of an exact knowledge. For her husband, Henry Elmer Wills, of New York, was an inventor and consulting engineer when she was married to him, and with him she spent 2 years in the deserts of Arizona. Honor Wills was born in Ottumwa, Iowa, the daughter of William Dunbar McHugh and Lily Bryant, Head, McHugh, and a descendant of old New Englanders who went west, the people who form the important background of Still Jim and Lydia of the Pines. She is a Bachelor of Arts of the University of Wisconsin and was married soon after her graduation. The 2 years in the West followed, and then the husband and wife came to New York, where Mrs. Wills devoted herself to the task of winning recognition as a writer. She says now, a plan, and always keeping your eye on what you want to be doing in 3 years or in 5 years, that is what makes for success for a writer. I came to New York with the intention of being a writer. I did not want to work on a magazine or a newspaper. And I wanted to write what I wanted to write. I had sold Bob Davis, Robert H. Davis, editor of Month's magazine, a little love story called Beatrice and the Rose. So after a few weeks in New York I went to see him with a bundle of stories I wanted him to buy. He looked them over and shook his head. "Do me something else like Beatrice and the Rose and I'll take it," he said. "I don't want to go on writing stuff like that," I explained. "If that's the best I can do, I'll give up writing altogether." But nobody wants to read about those deserts and glowing sunsets. There is only one man in New York who will read about deserts, Theodore Dreiser. All right, I decided. I will go to see Theodore Dreiser. I sent my stuff to Mr. Dreiser in advance, and next day I went down to see what he thought of it. I was pretty well scared. I walked around the Butterick building. 4 times I walked around that bulky Flatiron before I screwed up enough courage to go in. When I finally got inside and was ushered into Mr. Dreiser's office, the novelist was then editor of the Delineator, a job Mrs. Wills now holds. I was tongue-tied with nervousness. That nervousness might well have been prophetic. The interview turned out to be a momentous one for me. "My God," said Mr. Dreiser, looking me over. "Another infant come to New York to reform it." But after a little talk he offered me a job, editorial work at a good salary. "I'll have to think that over," I said, the temptation of a good regular salary struggling against my plans for writing, and writing only. "No," Mr. Dreiser ordered. "You sit right there and decide now. So I sat there and thought about it, and finally I told him that I wouldn't take his job. I had stuck out this far and I guessed I could go on. All right, Mr. Dresser agreed without argument. Stick it out at the writing game if you want to. It won't be easy, but you will make good. You will have a hard time at first, and you will need pluck. But in 5 years you will land and land big. As for these stories of yours, I will buy them. And he named a sum staggering to my inexperience, though he assured me he was taking advantage of me because I was unknown. Well, I kept on writing. I bought a second-hand typewriter and worked it with 2 fingers, and many times I thought of the salary I might have had coming in every week. As Mr. Dresser said, it wasn't easy. I made $500 that first year. Things came out my way because I stuck to my plan and always kept my eye on the future, and had the courage to refuse that job. Not long afterward, Mrs. Will's stories began to appear in the magazines and were unusually popular. She took up the writing of special articles for such periodicals as Harper's Weekly and Collier's on important subjects: immigration, divorce, Indians, the United States Reclamation Service. Norman Hapgood, who was then editor of Harper's Weekly, said of her work, "She has the ability to get at the essentials of a big question, and put it in simple, human terms." Mrs. Will's first published novel was The Heart of the Desert, which came out in 1913. It won immediate recognition for her. Richard Le Gaulien, writing an appreciation of Mrs. Wills in the book News Monthly of March, 1917, said, "As a boy, of course, I adored the American Indian of Fenimore Cooper, but, since then, words fail. If I have a beat noir in fiction, nowadays, it is the American Indian." I mention this purely personal peculiarity, merely to emphasize the delight which I took in Mrs. Wills's hero in The Heart of the Desert, and his truly heroic wooing and winning of a white girl, with Mrs. Wills's, and, I am sure, all her readers' concurrence. Never was such a masterful wooing, or one brought to winning through such heart-beating suspense, such a grim passionate race for love and life in so wild and starlit and infinite a setting. And he says that therefore when I say that, in my opinion, The Heart of the Desert is one of the best yarns and, if I may say so, one of the most virile love stories written in our time, it is not from any prejudice in favor of its subject matter. Mr. Le Gaulien's article is not long. We take the liberty to quote the rest of it from a booklet on Mrs. Wills prepared by the Frederica Stokes Company, her publishers. This booklet also contains an interesting article by Hildegard Hawthorne on Mrs. Wills and her novels. Says Mr. Le Gaulien, "My first acquaintance with Mrs. Honor Wills's books came through a photograph of her looks. The photograph, or photographs, to which I have reference occurred in a copy of Harper's Weekly, not so very long before that honored periodical was gathered to its fathers. They were taken by her husband, and represented Mrs. Wills in the heart of the Arizona desert, dizzily seated at the edge of a canyon, in camp democratically at dinner, with a stunning hat and a still more stunning smile, and so on." Here, one said, was the veritable girl of the Golden West, tall and fearless-eyed as Artemis, something like a symbolic figure of that noble type of Western woman, which accounts so largely for the proverbial chivalry and homicides of that portion of America which is at once most romantic and most real. One of these, particularly, haunted me, and with my subsequent acquaintance with Mrs. Wills's writings in mind, I must be forgiven one more use of the word symbolic. Mrs. Wills is seated in the foreground, a wilderness of sagebrush all about her, and a lonely stretch of barren mountain in the near background. Her head, of which you only see the massive coiled hair, is bent in an attitude, as of sorrow, close over her knees, from which her right hand hangs listlessly, almost touching the cowboy hat at her feet. "The close of a long day" is the caption of the picture. In the light of Mrs. Wills's books, that photograph has come to me to represent the attitude of her soul, the soul of a young American woman, to whom the idealism that made her country is a religion, in one of those moods of dejection which occasionally overcome all of us who love this great republic, at what too frequently seems like an eclipse, or even a decadence, of that idealism. As she sits there with bended head, like some heroic weeper, in that austere wilderness, her attitude seems to be saying what Lydia says so finally in her inspiring new book, Lydia of the Pines: "We've got too many lawyers in America. What I think America needs is real love of America. And it seems to me the best way to get it is to identify oneself with the actual soil of the community. What I want is this, that you and I, upon the ground where poor John Levine did such wrongs, will build us a home. I don't mean a home as Americans usually mean the word, I mean we'll try to found a family there. We'll send the roots of our roof tree so deep into the ground that for generations to come our children's children will be found there, and our family name will stand for old American ideals in the community. I don't see how else we Americans can make up to the world for the way we've exploited America." After looking at Mr. Wills's photographs, I chanced to be walking along Fifth Avenue, and glancing into a bookseller's windows, I beheld one of those pyramidal displays of a new book which I have sometimes thought must have exhausted the whole edition. The name of the book was still Jim. It was by the lady of Mr. Wills's beautiful photographs, and it was a real bestseller, said the bookseller, to whom I disbursed the needed $1 and whatever it was. No young writer could hope to live up to Mr. Wills's photographs, but I was happily astonished to find how near Mrs. Wills came to doing it. Apart from the book as a story, its quality of atmosphere, its breadth of vast spaces, its sense of heroic action on a great stage, were remarkable. There was, too, that background of character to the writing in which the life of a book mainly resides, and for lack of which so many clever books come and go, perishing like the summer skies. Lydia of the Pines, we have already quoted Mr. Le Gallienne's words on the heart of the desert, combines all Mrs. Wills's qualities and characteristics in a maturing ratio. The book shows her as growing nearer and nearer to that symbolic photograph of her. More and more she is seen as the passionate dreamer of the true American ideal, a practical dreamer, too, not afraid to arraign America to her face for wrong done in the past, and wrongs still a-doing. The theme of Lydia of the Pines is one of the noblest she could have chosen. The infamy of political corruption that is so subtly and cruelly doing the last wrong to the Indian by the legalized theft of his pitiful reservations. Where the pine forest is destroyed, the pines never come again. Such is the burden of this noble and very moving story of a high-souled but most human girl, whose family and friends are implicated in real estate deals with Indians of a nearby reservation. It is a simple story too, moving among simple lives, in a simple Western milieu which Mrs. Wills presents with great fidelity, with many touches of humor and pathos. In Lydia of the Pines one sees Mrs. Wills growing in strength, more surely becoming one of the authentic voices of the nobler Americanism, and her book is sure of a huge welcome by those who have that at heart. With equal enthusiasm Hildegard Hawthorne declares that Lydia of the Pines is the best thing Mrs. Wills has yet done. The author of this volume has endeavored generally to be reticent in the expression of personal preferences. He will only say that he does not agree with Miss Hawthorne about Lydia. He found it fearfully dull while fully conceding the interest of the ideas which Mrs. Wills never fails to present for her readers' contemplation. He admired the portrait of John Levine but deplored what he felt to be its lack of solidity. The reader sees Levine in two relations only, to Lydia and to the Indians, and unfortunately his relations to the Indians are mostly a matter of hearsay, what came to Lydia's ears, no more. To this writer still Jim seems by far the better book. But Miss Hawthorne is thoroughly right when she says, no one who reads Mrs. Wills's books can fail to be deeply interested in seeing how the writer grasps and lays before her public certain big problems confronting us, such as this of the downfall of the early traditions, the influx of races that have not our conception of government or of life, and now the Indian problem. In Lydia of the Pines the shameful story of our treatment of the red man is illuminatingly told. It is told with measure and good sense, and is concretely pictured, the facts concerning one reservation supplying the material. Those who wish to ascertain how closely Mrs. Wills sticks to facts need only hunt up the reports of the Board of Indian Commissioners in regard to the White Earth Reservation in Minnesota to find out. The whole story is there, told over and over again with endless, pitiful detail. In her novel Mrs. Wills has drawn intelligently upon that mass of testimony, handled it with a full realization of its drama, and also with a peculiarly broad understanding of both sides. Gertrude Atherton says, I think Lydia of the Pines is an American classic. Margaret Deland wrote to Mrs. Wills concerning Still Jim, all the book is American to the roots, but Big Jim is the American soul. It is too massive a book to write about in detail, it's the whole effect that moves me, truth, beauty and democracy. A fine piece of work, an honest heart behind it. I congratulate you. The element of mysticism in Mrs. Wills finds its outlet in the 2- and 3-line reveries which she puts at the head of her chapters. Thus in Still Jim a desert rock muses, humans constantly shift sand and rock from place to place. they call this work. I have seen time return their every work to the form in which it was created. Coyotes hunt weaker things. Humans hunt all things, even each other, which the coyote will not do. In Lydia of the Pines it is a pine tree which murmurs, the young pine knows the secrets of the ground. The old pine knows the stars. Nature is neither cruel nor sad. She is only purposeful, tending to an end we cannot see. There should be mention of Mrs. Wills's most recent book, Benefits Forgot, a study of Lincoln and mother love. This is a brief but true story of a young army surgeon for whose education his mother had made great sacrifices. Mrs. Wills tells how President Lincoln learned of the young man's neglect of his mother and brought him to realize his ingratitude. It is a very fine and very touching little story. Has the war changed Mrs. Wills's ideas and ideals? No, it has sustained and strengthened them. It has supplied her with evidence in their support and justification in their advancement. We quote an interview with the novelist by Maxwell Ailey. Wartime, Mrs. Wills said, is woman's time to show the stuff she is made of. This war is going to take the fluff out of feminism in America just as it did in England. It's hesitation and a twinkling eye, it's going to blow the foam off the feminist beer. A good figure, that, for feminism has certainly been something yeasty, something brewing, and with a little hop in it. I hope the war is going to make American women realize the importance of being women, and the chance that it gives them to mold the coming generation. As I see it, there are two things American women can do, one abstract and one concrete. They can teach children in this time of national stress what it means to be Americans, and in that way form the Americans of the future, and they can mobilize their resources and offer them to the government. Like all abstract things, the first is the more difficult. Women have got to get down from pink teas to brass tacks. If the average woman would only stop to realize just how important it is to be a woman. Why, women's business is not only the bringing into the world of the coming generation, but the molding of that generation's ideals. American men are too busy making a living to give much time to the children, it's the women who teach them at home and at school. And they ought to be taught what it means to be Americans as well as being taught religion and morals, or grammar and geography. But here's the rub. To teach children that, a woman has got to realize what it means herself. How many do? I hope more women realize it than men, that is, than the men I've asked. Several years ago I started out asking all sorts of men what is an American. I asked bahunks and guineas at work on street construction, I asked American men in every walk in life, and what do you suppose I got as an average answer? That an American was a man who knew how to get rich quick. This war has shown us that taking out naturalization papers, or even being born here, doesn't necessarily make an American. We've found out that the melting pot doesn't always melt. To be an American you must have a certain philosophy of government, and only a thoughtful person can have a philosophy at all. If you are going to be a true American, You've got to think things out. You've got to come to an understanding of the big ideals on which the men who founded this country built. Every American who does that develops a paradox. He finds first that he has a sense of freedom and equality, and then he arrives at a feeling of responsibility. That latter feeling has been very evident among thinking Americans since the beginning of the European War, and it is particularly evident now. It's up to American women, then, to think out what it means to be Americans before they attempt to teach their children, or someone else's children, what it means. I wish that we might have an American litany, a national creed that mothers and teachers could give to our children. I wish that every American child might be brought to understand the state of mind of the men who wrote and signed our Declaration of Independence, a state of mind compounded of utter bravery, the spirit of self-sacrifice, and a devotion to cause and country that made them literally offer up their lives, their fortunes and their sacred honor. Now do you see why I said the abstract thing women have a chance to do is the hard thing? But if it is the more difficult, I believe it is also the more important. As for the concrete thing, that is already being done to a certain extent. Women have begun offering their services to the government through their various organizations, but they ought to do it more completely. If we are to have universal service for men, we ought to have a variety of universal service for women, at least a mobilization of the resources of all the women in the country. I believe that women here in America will get the vote out of this war as women are getting it in England, but American women will have to show, as English women have done, that they are worthy of the vote. And there is one thing American women must not forget, that the most important thing they can mobilize is their sex. When the men of a country give their bodies to the sword, the women must give theirs to the future, to the generation to come. Now, more than in peace times, women owe it to their country to bear children, and bear them intelligently. And when they have borne them, it is their sacred duty to bring them up Americans in a full understanding of the ideals on which our fathers built the nation. Living in New York, writing in New York, working in New York as the managing editor of the Delineator, Mrs. Wills is still and essentially the woman of Mr. Wills's photographs which made so forcible an impression on Mr. Le Gaulien. With her is always a splendid vision, exquisite violet mists rolled back toward the mountains. The pungent odor of sagebrush floated through the tent. Iridescent, bejeweled, flashing every rainbow tint from its moistened breast, the desert smiled at us. Once more I yielded to its loveliness. To her and her vision many of her countrymen and countrywomen will always yield gratefully and with pleasure. Books by Honor Wills. The Heart of the Desert, 1913. Still Jim, 1915. Lydia of the Pines, 1917. Benefits Forgot, 1917. The Forbidden Trail, 1919. The Enchanted Canyon, 1921. Judith of the Godless Valley, 1922. Published by Frederica Stokes Company, New York. Chapter XXI Francis Hodgson Burnett. Half a dozen plays and half 100 stories stand to the credit of Francis Hodgson Burnett, born in Manchester, England, naturalized as an American citizen in 1905 or thereabouts, the author of Little Lord Fauntleroy, most famous of children's stories by a living writer. Mrs. Burnett is a novelist, as such books as The Shuttle and T. Baron attest. She is thought of half or more than half the time as a writer of tales for youngsters, and rightly. Of these she has produced a great number and their success is amazing. No beating of drums, no blasts on trumpets, even toy trumpets, yet as the publishers assure you, in respect of even her less-known juveniles they keep on selling, year after year, with the most relentless endurance. They don't have to be advertised. In the famous sentiment of a famous advertisement, they are advertised by their loving friends. The best thing for the adult to do, after paying his tribute to Fauntleroy, is to read The Shuttle, a novel of international marriage. It represents Mrs. Burnett's life. She alone of all the writers of our day could have written such a book, declares a friend whose desire to remain anonymous is here observed. He supplies a sketch of Mrs. Burnett which had better be reproduced verbatim. She is English of the English by birth and temperament, born in Manchester, as you know, where she lived until she was about 13. Then, her father having failed in business, owing to the war in America, his failure had something to do with the blockading of the southern ports, I believe, and he having died, the business went to ruin, although Mrs. Burnett's mother tried her gentle best to save it. There was a large family of them, and Francis, who had already developed the faculty of storytelling, was the life and spirit of the crowd. An older brother had gone to join an uncle in Tennessee, and when the family's fortunes were at lowest ebb he advised them to join him in America, which they did, and lived in the greatest poverty on the outskirts of Knoxville. They were so poor that when someone suggested that Frances write out one of her stories and send it to Godey's Lady's Book, the money for the stamps had to be earned by picking blackberries. The first story was accepted and all subsequent stories sent. Then Mrs. Burnett graduated to Peterson's magazine. The Petersons were great friends of Mrs. Burnett in her early days. They recommended that she send some of her stories to the Century, which she did, but the quality of them was so English that the Century editors suspected they were not original but copied by the little Tennessee girl from stories in English magazines. When her second story was sent to them, they gave expression to their doubt. The thing was explained to them, and the publication of the stories, I believe the first was Surly Tim's Troubles, was made immediately. Mrs. Burnett has always kept in touch with England and English life. As soon as she had made her success, in fact, just after the publication of that Lasso Lowries, she went back to England, and has spent some part of nearly every year in England since then. She has lived in all sections of England and has had houses in London, one at 63 Portland Place and another in Charles Street, Mayfair. She has had country homes in Norfolk, Kent and Surrey. For nearly 15 years she leased a very interesting old house in Kent, Maytham Hall, really the manor house of a very ancient estate. The house stands in the most wonderful of Kentish gardens which Mrs. Bennet, with her enthusiasm for gardening, made even more beautiful than they were when she took them. Maytham Hall was the homestead of an ancient family of Moneypenneys. On the corner of the Hall grounds stands an ancient Norman church, the Church of the Hundred of Rolvenden, which is mentioned in the Domesty Book. All the Moneypenneys are buried in this church, which, in its simple way, is of remarkable beauty. Their tombstones surround the great hall pew, which is almost as big as a room, and has tables and chairs in it. The whole grounds stand between two very picturesque villages, both appanages of the estate, one called Rolvenden Village and the other Rolvenden Street. They are as picturesque as they can be, full of the quaint old gaffers and gammers. As to the American side of Mrs. Bennet, she has lived over here in touch with the most characteristically and the most broadly American society in Washington and later in New York and its vicinity. As a young girl she saw a good deal of New York life, and it was during that time, I imagine, that she got the impressions that produced the earlier part of the Shuttle. Her saying that she was English by birth and American by the birth of her two sons I have always thought an amusing expression of her case. In describing Bettina to me, once, she said that Bettina was a woman's version of the cleverness and sense of values that the first Reuben Vandenpoel expressed. This seems to me to be the underlying quality in Bettina. Her sense of the world of things backed by her balance, her self-control and her typical American practicality. Mrs. Bennet loathes New York for its noise and dirt. Though she no longer has Maytham Hall with its great terraced lawns and its rose gardens, she has a big country place near Manhasset, Long Island, New York, called Plandome. It is within commuting distance of New York, but oh, how different! A comfortable, rambling house is surrounded by gardens for which Mrs. Bennet buys flowers as uncontrollably as a bibliophile buys books. The house faces northwest and has remarkable glimpses of sunsets. Mrs. Bennet naturally has many children as visitors. For them there is a great doll house, the home of Lady Annabel, who is larger than many of the youngsters that call on her, and who has a wonderful wardrobe. The big house is full of nests of children's toys. It also contains much age-darkened furniture brought over from Maytham Hall, principally oak pieces of the 15th and 16th centuries which Mrs. Bennet has collected. Lady Annabel's residence, for example, was formerly a bread and cheese cupboard which an antiquarian would tell you was probably made by a skilled woodworker not later than the year 1500. As if visitors were not enough, in such numbers as are hers, Mrs. Bennet is always neighborizing. To children who live nearby her she read chapters of The Secret Garden as they were finished. Now, she is a most skillful reader. A very little girl of the lot sat listening for hours on end. Impressions which flowered in the secret garden came from Maytham Hall, where the rose gardens are surrounded by walls about 900 years old. Peasmarsh, Smallhive, Benenden are the names of towns not far from Maytham Hall, and all over the countryside you may encounter, or could not many years back, children wearing red cloaks given them by the Earl of Cranbrook. And what is the secret of the secret garden? What does all this delightful picturesqueness enclose? Why, an idea, namely, that if a healthful thought be planted in the mind it pushes out unhealthful thoughts, and that if the body be unwell it adjusts itself to the healthful thought and grows well. The secret garden which, with its roses, surrounds the characters of the story, plants in their minds all sorts of healthful thoughts. Mrs. Bennet is not metaphysical, however. Her roses, she declares, are always sincere and endlessly instructive. She has suffered much from people who have interviewed her and have not understood her, departing to write what they wanted her to say. She has a philosophy, but it is written in her books, definitely and decidedly. It has no other existence, and it cannot be separated from the tales which are its embodiment. It is a peculiar characteristic of hers that the moment an idea, a concept philosophically speaking, formulates itself in her mind it does so as some part of a story. Her pleasant persons and places have as definite ideas and theories and beliefs as the most serious thesis, but since they never presented themselves abstractly to Mrs. Bennet they are not so conveyed by her. It is really presumptuous, under the circumstances, to endeavour to express them abstractly as we have just done in the case of the secret garden. This will seem a hard saying to most of us, who are trained to try to get at the kernel of everything. All modern education is designed to teach men and women to think and express themselves abstractly with ease and freedom and surety. Why? Because since the Greeks certain abstractions and abstract thought and expression generally have been prized as the best and safest and handiest medium of intellectual exchanges. They are the intellectual coinage, a kind of verbal money that obviates the clumsy old methods of barter. But while we are all used to money and would not do without it, we have to remember that the majority of mankind still carries on a vast amount of intellectual exchange by barter. You tell me an actual incident or a story you have heard, and I tell you what I have experienced or heard. We swap experiences and knowledge, and each benefits by what he gets from the other without so much as drawing a single abstract conclusion or generalization. The method has its disadvantages, but lack of interest is not one of them. Understand this and you understand Mrs. Bennet. She is dealing with you as you would deal with your neighbor. You would not go to your neighbor and say, "It is possible to live too long." You would go and tell him, "John Smith's mother isn't treated decently yesterday," etc., and you would relate the actual occurrence. He would nod. And he would tell you something in exchange. And neither of you would generalize about your respective narrations, but each of you would take the lesson in them well to heart. That is the way of the world and of neighbors. It is Mrs. Bennet's easily comprehended way too. When she leaves Plandome, Mrs. Bennet consents to spend a few days in noisome New York. You can buy things there, after all, and editors and publishers there do congregate, and then she flees to Bermuda. but not until the last cosmos of autumn has perished and gone and every flower bed at Plandome has been tucked in a blanket of fertilizer. In Bermuda she gardens. She imports, in times more favorable than the present, countless roses from England. Her Bermuda cottage is unpretentious but charming. To revert for a moment to the shuttle, we may note something almost prescient in what Mrs. Bennet said, in 1907, about England and America, in a letter respecting this novel. She somewhat regretted the characterization of the book as a novel of international marriage. That, she argued, was hardly her theme. Of course not. She has no abstract themes. She wrote, "The subject of international marriage is an enormous one, and if I had written all I have been observing for years and all I should have liked to write, I should have made a 3-volume novel." When I say the subject, I do not mean merely the international marriage question, but the whole international outlook upon a situation between two great countries such as the history of the world, as far as I know it, has not previously recorded. The wonderfulness of it lies in the fact that two nations which were one, having parted with violence and bitterness, are with a strange sureness being drawn nearer, nearer to each other. That they are of the same blood, the mere fact that they speak the same tongue, makes the thing inevitable in the end. I do not mean the shuttle to be merely a story of international marriage, but to suggest 1,000 other things. The international marriage must, however, result in being a strong factor, and in the hands of a writer of fiction it must play a prominent part, a leading part, so to speak, because it is the love story, and without it we are lost. For the matter of that, without it the shouting and the tumult would die, the captains and the kings depart. Because I am English by birth and American by a sort of adoption, and because I have vibrated between the two continents for years, I have learned to be impersonal and unpartisan. I was neither American nor English when I told the story. I was merely an intensely interested person who had formed a habit of crossing Atlantic twice a year.